For 3 decades, Sydney Brooks Simpson lived behind silence. The daughter of O.J. Simpson and Nicole Brown Simpson had seen the world twist her family's tragedy into headlines, jokes, and courtroom drama. But while the public obsessed over the trial of the century, Sydney was living with the one thing no verdict could erase: memory. It wasn't fame or fortune that shaped her life. It was a night in 1994 that never ended. The night everything changed. On June 12, 1994, Los Angeles police were called to 875 South Bundy Drive in Brentwood. 2 bodies lay outside, Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ronald Goldman. Inside the quiet condominium, upstairs in a bedroom, 2 small children were found asleep. One of them was 8-year-old Sydney Brooks Simpson. For the world, it became a crime scene. For Sydney, it was the night her life split in 2, before and after. The investigation would turn into the most watched legal spectacle in modern history. Cameras filled the streets. Reporters hunted every detail. Her father, Orenthal James Simpson, once America's football hero, was accused of murdering his ex-wife. When the famous white Ford Bronco sped down the freeway days later, Sydney was hidden away with family members, too young to understand what the chase meant, but old enough to feel the fear in every adult's face. What the world didn't know, or maybe never cared to ask, was what the children heard that night. Years later, in a private statement filed with a legal agency in 2024, Sydney said she remembered heavy footsteps, a crash, a scream, then silence. She recalled seeing a large male figure with blood on his hands standing near the backyard doorway. At 8 years old, she couldn't make sense of it. But as she wrote decades later, "I knew it from that day on." When detectives questioned her in 1994, she was shielded by lawyers and relatives. No one wanted to traumatize her further, and no one wanted a child to hold the key to a nation's nightmare. The official report simply recorded that both children were found unharmed. What they didn't say was how deeply the silence scarred them. School records from Brentwood Elementary later showed that Sydney suffered panic episodes, anxiety, and fear of loud noises. She refused to sit near doors, cried at the sound of footsteps, and was eventually transferred to a smaller private facility to reduce stress. After her mother's funeral, custody was granted to Nicole's family, led by her grandmother, Juditha Brown. The Browns, already broken by grief, took in Sydney and her younger brother Justin, trying to build something resembling normal life. But normal was gone. Every magazine cover, every television rerun of the trial kept the wound open. Even at 9 years old, Sydney had become part of history, but without a choice. When the trial began in January 1995, the world waited for a confession. But for Sydney, it was the beginning of a lifetime of suppression. In therapy sessions during those years, she drew pictures of 2 houses, one large, bright, and safe, the other dark, with red marks near the door. Her therapist described the drawings as signs of deep trauma. Yet the family refused media attention, refusing interviews, television, and photographs. The Browns knew that any appearance would turn the children into props in a national circus. On October 3, 1995, O.J. Simpson was acquitted. In homes across America, 100 million people watched the verdict live. Some cheered, some cried. But for Sydney, there was only confusion. The man she once called Daddy was free, but her mother was still gone. That paradox would follow her for the rest of her life. By the end of 1996, reports from child services showed Sydney struggling with recurring nightmares and isolation. Teachers described her as polite, withdrawn, and fearful of strangers. The media frenzy faded for the world, but inside her, the noise never stopped. The years of silence. The late 1990s were a blur of custody hearings, therapists, and a quiet determination to stay hidden. After O.J. Simpson's acquittal, Sydney and her brother Justin were placed under the care of their grandmother, Juditha Brown, and Aunt Tanya. The Browns kept the children away from the cameras, from questions, and from the shadow of the Rockingham mansion that had once been home. Every step was taken to protect them from the world, but no one could protect them from what was already inside their minds. Sydney rarely spoke in public, not even within the family. According to a social worker's note from 1996, she often refused to answer questions about her parents. When asked to describe her mother, she would say, "She smiled a lot." When asked about her father, she said nothing. Behind closed doors, the trauma turned into silence, a silence so deep that even professionals called it a protective mechanism. By 2000, the Browns made a difficult decision. Sydney and Justin would move to Florida to live a quieter life away from Los Angeles. The goal was simple: anonymity. In Florida, no one cared about the trial, the cameras, or the endless debates about guilt and innocence. Here, Sydney could be just another student, or at least try to be. In Florida, she attended Gulliver Preparatory High School from 2000 to 2003. Her teachers described her as bright but emotionally distant. She avoided personal conversations and rejected any attention that mentioned her last name. Administrative records show that her family requested her identity be kept private during school events, even asking the yearbook committee to remove her photo. When she graduated, she carried the weight of a name she couldn't escape. Still, she was determined to build her own story. In 2004, Sydney enrolled at Boston University, majoring in sociology with a concentration in criminology and deviant behavior, a choice that reflected the deep questions she had been living with since childhood. Her thesis focused on the psychological impact of family murders on children, using real cases, but never mentioning her own. Professors noted her meticulous research, her empathy, and her emotional restraint. Beneath the surface, she was studying herself without saying it aloud. College gave her a taste of freedom. She made a few close friends, but her boundaries were strict. No talk of family, no questions about the past, no media. She never joined campus organizations or spoke in public forums. Privacy was not just a preference, it was survival. After graduating in 2008, Sydney began working for a nonprofit organization in Atlanta that supported children affected by domestic violence. For 14 months, she served quietly as a case coordinator, helping others whose lives mirrored her own in ways they would never know. A supervisor later described her as reserved, deeply empathetic, and dedicated to her clients. It was during those years that Sydney started writing private notes about her memories. Notes that would remain locked away for decades. Some of them, later recovered in legal filings, revealed her struggles to reconcile the image of her father with the man she saw that night in Brentwood. One line read, "I was taught to love him, but I remember being afraid of his voice." By 2010, Sydney had grown into a woman determined to stay invisible. She avoided interviews, rejected documentary requests, and changed her address multiple times. In an era where everyone shared everything online, she built walls instead. No social media, no public footprint. The final confrontation. By the 2010s, Sydney Brooks Simpson had finally built the quiet life she'd long wanted. Living in St. Petersburg, Florida, she kept far from Los Angeles, far from headlines, and far from the past. While her father, O.J. Simpson, served time in a Nevada prison for armed robbery, Sydney built her own world, buying and renovating homes, running a small real estate company under her full name. It was her way of reclaiming identity on her own terms. In 2012, she began a relationship with Stuart Alexander Lee, a British national. He later described her as kind but distant, haunted by nightmares and memories she never discussed. Her only rule, never mention her father's name. When O.J. was released on parole in 2017, Sydney stayed silent. She didn't attend his hearing, didn't speak to the press, didn't reach out. But in 2019, she agreed to see him one last time. The meeting was brief and heavy with unspoken truth. OJ handed her a copy of If I Did It and said, "You should read this. You'll understand me better." In a later written statement, Sidney revealed, "He didn't have to say it. The way he looked at me, I knew that was their final meeting." She walked away, ending all contact, and soon after, formally rejected any inheritance from her father's estate, her last act of separation and her quiet acknowledgement of what she had always known. The death of OJ and Sidney's revelation. On April 10, 2024, the man once called the Juice, Orenthal James Simpson, died in Las Vegas at the age of 76. The official cause was complications from metastatic prostate cancer. His death was confirmed by his family through a brief statement on social media asking for privacy. The announcement was polite, distant, and sterile, but behind it was a daughter who had already made her peace long before the world read the news. By the time OJ fell gravely ill, Sidney had not spoken to him in years. The only exception was a short private visit in late 2023, just months before his death. Records from a hospital aide who was present that day describe a scene stripped of reconciliation. OJ lay weak, barely conscious, while Sidney stood at the foot of the bed. She told the aide, "I didn't come to forgive him. I came to let him know I still remember." According to that same witness, OJ shed tears, but never spoke. Sidney's final words before leaving the room were quiet, but final. "I am no longer your daughter." After his death, her actions were swift and precise. She did not attend the funeral. Her name was not listed on the death certificate as next of kin. She was not a beneficiary of his estate, not even mentioned in the will. Legal documents later filed in Clark County confirmed that Sidney had signed a formal disclaimer 3 months before his death. "I disclaim all rights to any portion of the estate, whether directly or indirectly, of O.J. Simpson." It was a rare and powerful act, a daughter legally cutting ties with her father forever. But her separation was not about money. It was about morality. In an accompanying statement released by her law firm in May 2024, Sidney wrote 6 short paragraphs, the last of which read, "I retain the right to choose what memory will survive in my life. I choose to keep my mother." That one sentence echoed louder than any verdict ever delivered in court. For decades, the world had argued about OJ's guilt or innocence. But for the person who had lived in that house, who had seen the unthinkable as a child, there was never a question. She had carried the truth in silence, and now finally she spoke it, not in front of cameras, but in the clean, unemotional language of law. Sidney's revelation didn't come through a press conference or an interview. It came through documents, through her signed refusals, her legal withdrawals, her public absence. Every action, every refusal, every silent statement became part of a larger confession that she had seen, known, and chosen to live outside the shadow of her father's legacy. In the months that followed OJ's death, several media outlets tried to reach Sidney for comment. None succeeded. Her representatives issued one consistent response: "Ms. Simpson will not be participating in any public discussions related to Mr. Simpson's passing." But the truth was already out, not through words, but through what she left behind. In May 2024, internal estate documents confirmed that Sidney had disowned all assets linked to her father, including undisclosed joint investments and trust holdings from the early 2000s. The decision was absolute. "I cannot accept anything that has my mother's blood on it," she wrote in a private addendum. "Whether it is legal or not, it is morally wrong." Her refusal wasn't a rejection of inheritance. It was an act of liberation. For 30 years, Sidney had been the silent child of the world's most public tragedy. But with one document, She transformed that silence into truth. For the first time since 1994, she was free, not from the past, but from its weight. Rebuilding a life from the ashes. After her father's death, Sydney Brooks Simpson didn't vanish. She simply continued the life she had already been building in silence. By 2020, she had become the majority owner and CEO of JMI Investment Properties, a real estate company based in St. Petersburg, Florida. Every property, every business document carried her full legal name. No initials, no pseudonyms, no trace of her father's identity. It was her way of reclaiming something she had never been allowed to own: herself. Financial reports from 2021 showed her company's net worth exceeding $3 million, with steady growth and zero debt. She managed everything through law firms and independent accountants, never allowing her name to be used for publicity. Her focus was stability, privacy, and control, three things she never had as a child. Outside of business, Sydney married a non-public partner in 2020 and became a mother in 2021. She named her daughter after her late mother's middle name, a quiet tribute to Nicole Brown Simpson. Friends who knew her described her as peaceful, guarded, but deeply devoted to family. She continued her anonymous philanthropy, funding programs for orphans and survivors of domestic violence. There were no interviews, no social media posts, no public statements, only paper trails, each one confirming that she had built a world separate from the one that destroyed her childhood. Sydney Simpson's story reminds us that even after the loudest storms, peace can exist in quiet forms. She didn't seek revenge or fame, only closure. What do you think about her decision to leave everything behind? Would you have done the same? If you believe her strength deserves to be remembered, hit like, share this video, and subscribe for more untold stories that history tried to forget.